Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. This is Unit 5, Lesson number 1. And Lesson number 1 is on a term that we use in chemistry called a mole. And you're going to learn exactly what a mole is. It is a confusing topic for students many times. So let's get into that. So, what exactly is a mole? A mole is many times referred to as a chemist's dozen. What does that mean? Well, everybody knows that the term dozen, it's a pretty universal term. A dozen of something means that you have 12. A dozen bagels means you have 12 bagels. A dozen apples means that you have a dozen apples. Well, in chemistry, we would never say a dozen atoms of some element because the mass of a dozen atoms, even though you might think it's a lot, is extremely tiny because each atom has a very, very tiny mass. So we would never say 12 atoms and the mass of 12 atoms. So scientists, because we would use much larger numbers, came up with a term which is similar to a dozen in that it means a specific number of something, and that's called a mole. It's called Avogadro's number. That number is 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd. So 1 mole of anything is the same number of particles, just like a dozen of something is the same amount. In other words, a dozen bagels is 12, a dozen apples is 12. Well, a mole of atoms would be 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd. A mole of apples would be 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd. And just how big is this number? Well, if you remember in scientific notation, to change this to a regular number, you'd have to take the decimal, which is here, move it 23 places to the right, which is this number here. So it would be a tremendous number. And we can say a mole could mean 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd molecules or atoms or ionic compounds, pretty much any particle. Now, what are the units for moles? Well, this is where it gets a little weird. There are 2 units that you can use. One is called an AMU. This is called an atomic mass unit, and you should write that down. This is atomic mass unit. And the atomic mass unit is based on a carbon atom. Forgetting all of that, just remember that AMUs, atomic mass units, are virtually the same thing as grams. So if we look at, for example, at the bottom, we get 12 grams of carbon. Now, where did we get 12 grams of carbon? That's the mass, that's the atomic mass or mass number of carbon from the periodic table rounded to a whole number. Well, the mass of the elements on the periodic table, for example, 12 grams of carbon atoms happens to be the same thing as 1 mole of carbon atoms, meaning that if I have 12 grams of carbon atoms, I don't need to count the atoms of carbon, which would be impossible anyway. I know for a fact it would be 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd atoms of carbon. It's the same thing if I said I had a dozen carbon atoms. I know that's going to be 12. Well, if I have a mole of carbon atoms, it would be 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd atoms of carbon, which would be the equivalent of 12 grams. So this would be the mass, this is the term mole, and this would be how many particles. So that means basically, if you look at your periodic table, if you look at the mass of any element on the periodic table, the mass of any element on the periodic table is the same as the mass of 1 mole of that element. 1 mole would be 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd atoms of carbon. So that's the term that we're looking at, which is called a mole. It's a very confusing term, and it's really kind of important that you understand what it means. So, for example, and this is one of the things you'll have to be able to do later on, is we all know that 12 grams of carbon is equal to 1 mole, which is equal to 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd. Well, one of the things that you should be able to do, just a basic thing, is, well, let's say instead of 12 grams, what about if I had 6 grams of carbon? Well, obviously, if 12 grams of carbon is 1 mole, 6 grams of carbon would be zero point 0.5 moles, or a half a mole. What would you do to this number then? Well, you'd have to cut it in half. Fortunately, when the number's in scientific notation, you really don't have to touch this number. To cut this whole number in half, you simply just cut the first number in half. So a half, 6 grams of carbon, which is equal to 0.5 moles of carbon atoms, would be equal to 3.01 times 10 to the 23rd atoms of carbon. Well, what about if I had 24 grams of carbon? Well, you can see that that would, of course, be 2 moles. What do? I double this number. It would be 12.04 times 10 to the 23rd atoms of carbon. And that is your introduction to the mole.